Hello, everybody, and welcome to another DPReview team discussion. It's been a really busy week on DPReview with a lot of new camera, lens, and also iPhone news. Today, we're actually going to talk about a couple of the new video-oriented cameras from Nikon and Canon that have been announced this week, and also a little bit about why we're hearing so much about video all of a sudden. Joining me on the discussion today are Mitchell Clark.
Hi.
And Richard.
Hello.
And I'm Dale. I'm the managing editor here at DPReview. And it has been a really busy week this week, particularly for video. We've seen a lot of talk about video this week. And Richard, there's probably a reason why there's a lot of talk about video. I know everyone always gets up in arms and says, the camera manufacturers don't care about video. Excuse me, the camera manufacturers don't care about still photography anymore. But there's probably a reason why there's a lot of talk about video this week. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the International Broadcasting Conference, IBC, is just about to start in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. So obviously a lot of the launches this week have been quite focused on the video and cinema markets. So yeah, don't give up hope that that's the only thing that everyone seems to be interested in. It just happens to coincide with the trade show.
But Mitchell, I think it's really important to point out that even though there's been a lot of video talk this week, there's been a lot for photographers as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We had like a bunch of stills focused cameras or stills focused lenses coming from Sigma. We had the 135 f1.4, so that's like a really nice portrait lens. We had the second gen 35mm f1.2, which is substantially smaller and lighter than its predecessor and has they are promising, better chromatic aberration performance, just better optics overall. And then they also released this 20-200, which is like a pretty wide-ranging zoom for full-frame cameras that is quite small and light. It is a 3.5 to 6.3, but it's still like a really nice little travel lens. We also had OM System releasing its 50-200 f2.8, sort of a pretty far-reaching telephoto lens, especially given that it works with teleconverters. And then Tamron is announcing a 25-200 f2.8 to 5.6, which seems like a very obvious competitor to that Sigma lens. That's not coming out just yet, but it's on its way.
And on top of this, Canon announced an 85mm f1.4 VCM, which becomes, I think, the fifth 1.4 VCM lens. It shares the same body size, but that's a classic portrait lens, sort of mid-range. I mean, it's L. It's got Canon's L designation, so it's not cheap. But yeah, there's that from Canon as well.
And as if it wasn't busy enough, I believe we also had a compact camera from Canon. And on top of that, this week, as everybody probably knows by now, Apple introduced its newest series of iPhones, the iPhone 17, which has also taken a lot of space on the front page this week. So yeah, it's absolutely been a busy week. But for today's team discussion, we're actually going to focus on some of those video-oriented products because there's a couple really interesting ones, in particular, the Nikon ZR and the Canon C50. And Richard, I know you and Mitchell both worked on the ZR initial review, but maybe you can start out by telling us a little bit about that camera and what it is.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Nikon ZR, the thing that it's most likely to remind you of is Sony's FX series, or maybe their ZV series of vlogging cameras. But I think it straddles that line between vlogging and filmmaking. But very much towards the mass market. It's $21.99. It's comparatively affordable for a full frame interchangeable lens filmmaker's camera. But yeah, even though it's a relatively inexpensive model, it offers both NRAW video shooting and new R3D NE, which is a variation on Red Code RAW, designed to be cross-compatible with it. So it should be compatible with all the same LUTs, and that's gaining support from some editing software. So that offers two different ways, along with ProRes RAW. It's a surprisingly high video spec for a camera costing so little.
Yeah, and Mitchell, I know a lot of people are going to be interested in this camera strictly from the standpoint that a couple of years ago, Nikon acquired Red Digital Cinema, and we've been seeing signs that maybe there's some convergence coming between product and technologies between those two companies. We see a Red name on this camera. How much Red is in this camera?
That's a really interesting question. And yeah, like Richard mentioned, it does have that version of Red's Red Code RAW codec, which means that you should be able to pretty easily cut together footage from sort of the ZR and Red's other more cinema-oriented cameras. To your point, it does have Red on the back. It shares co-branding with Nikon, but a lot of it internally does seem to come more from Nikon's division in terms of the menus. Those are very much look like what you'd find on a Z6 III, which this camera shares the sensor with. It's got stabilization, and it's got Nikon's autofocus system, including support for various types of subject tracking, which is not generally something that you'd see on a cinema camera, but I suspect won't be unwelcome for most people. It's also got, a couple of firsts, or it also has a couple of firsts that we haven't seen on most other cinema cameras, and certainly no mirrorless cameras, such as support for 32-bit float audio recording internally. There's been a couple of cameras from Panasonic that support that, but they do require a external $500 XLR adapter. This one can do it straight out of the box, including on that 3.5 millimeter input. So that gives you a lot more latitude when it comes to not necessarily having to set the gain exactly correctly on your camera to avoid peaking or being too quiet.
Yeah, essentially, 32-bit float gives you a vast range of data values with which to store audio. So usually 32-bit float is combined with dual amplifiers. So you've got one that's not adding much one that's not adding much amplification to make sure you maintain the very loud noises, but another one that's applying quite a large amount of gain so that you capture the quiet noises. Obviously, you still have to worry about things like background noise, but you don't have to, essentially expose to the right and try and sort of, give yourself as much amplification as you possibly can, but be constantly worrying about peaking and clipping. You've got enough latitude within the file, but also, as I say, it's usually combined with dual gain amplification to mean that you essentially no longer have to worry, don't have to worry at all about clipping, and you rarely have to worry about the minimum level either.
Yeah, and I think 32-bit float, it's an incredibly useful tool. And it is something I know some people have struggled to wrap their minds around in terms of exactly how it works. Richard, there's one analogy that you've used for me a couple of times to help explain it. And it may not be a perfect analogy, but I think it helps with the general understanding. And that is, how is it analogous to the way some camera sensors have a dual gain mode? Is that a fair analogy to help explain how 32-bit float operates?
Not especially. I think it's more comparable to the sort of, the dual gain systems that Canon and ARRI use, where the output of the sensor goes through two different gain steps simultaneously. Most cameras we see on the photo side of things use either a low gain step or a high gain step. The exception to this appears to be the Panasonic S1 Mark II, but we're going to be digging into that a little more in the coming weeks. But essentially, you're capturing both. You're applying a high level of amplification and a low level of amplification to the same signal, so that you capture all the fine detail in the quiet sounds, but also you capture all the loud noises without them being clipped, because you've got all of this. You're not applying so much amplification, and you've got all this room to store it. So,
speaking of dual gain steps, this camera has two of them. Which is not unusual. However, it does add something new for Nikon in that it allows you to, with the Red codec, choose which one you're using specifically. And instead of applying gain to the signal itself and recording that, it simply uses the standard output from whichever gain step you've selected, and any ISO adjustments that you make are a metadata adjustment rather than an actual amplification of the signal. So that it gives you a little bit more latitude to change your brightness or lightness in post.
So we've increasingly seen over the last maybe 10 years cameras that have such low noise levels that there's very little benefit to applying further gain. So it's a property we tend to refer to as ISO invariance. No sensor can be fully ISO invariant, but particularly dual conversion gain sensors, when you hit that second step, there's almost no further benefit to adding any more gain. So what this camera does is something also available in the Sony FX models. They call it Cinema EI. Essentially, the camera locks to either its base or its second conversion gain step, and it generates all of its let's say ISO settings from those two gain steps. And that means that you're always capturing at one of the two optimal points, and because you've got all of this latitude in the raw file, you can then adjust. You can adjust the nominal ISO setting in the editor, which you can't do with NRAW, but you can do with Redcode RAW. So it's really interesting to see. Just like the Sonys, it does offer you these two different approaches, but instead of explicitly saying, look, do you want ISO or do you want Cine EI, it's a question of which raw workflow you choose to adopt.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And Mitchell, I know you've done a lot of video work. From a pragmatic standpoint, is there a particular reason why you might choose to use one of those approaches versus the other?
I think it largely comes down to how much flexibility you want in post. Raw video is, let's say, not as big a leap up from the sort of more standard outputs that you can get as it is in stills, where you've got like an 8-bit SDR, JPEG, and then a 12, 14, 16-bit RAW. But there are times when it would be useful to be able to more finely tune your lightness in post, and that's maybe where you would want to choose between one of the two RAW formats, or I guess one of the three RAW formats that this camera supports.
And the other thing it does is it means that each extra step of gain you add basically pushes a stop of captured highlights into clipping. Now, if you then lock to one of your base conversion gain steps and don't add any further gain, you've got the opportunity to capture increasing amounts of highlights that would otherwise be lost, in return for very little benefit in terms of noise in the shadows. So but it gives you both more flexibility in terms of how much control you have in post, but potentially it means that you're going to capture more dynamic range more of the time. So logically, it's probably a smarter way of working. And I saw a comment this morning saying, "Oh, could you ask Nikon to provide a similar way of working for stills?" And actually, given the way that modern sensors perform, it would be really nice if we saw some way of exploiting this sort of these highly ISO invariant sensors and let you make the most of them, as opposed to having to expose them in a sort of slightly clunky metaphor for the way that film should be exposed, which is where we currently stand with ISO.
That's potentially a whole other discussion right there. One of the things that's interesting to me on this camera, it doesn't have one, it doesn't have two, it has 3 different formats for capturing raw video. Have we seen any other cameras in this price class that have that ability?
No, in fact, we've just updated our database in order to be able to cope with the idea that a camera can shoot a proprietary RAW format and it's still proprietary, but it's more common Apple ProRes RAW format. We hadn't anticipated a camera that would shoot 2 proprietary RAW formats plus ProRes RAW, so we're going to have to rework our database to actually capture all the different video modes this camera offers.
Of course, when it comes to sort of these more video-focused cameras, there is a lot of it that goes into it that's about capturing and what formats it supports, but there's also sort of the ergonomic aspects of it. How does it work in a gimbal? How well does it work with sort of the various other accessories that you need to make videos? And this camera has a fair number of design features that like are video focused. For example, it does not have an EVF, but it does have a quite large 4-inch screen that can go up to 1,000 nits of peak brightness, which should be relatively visible in sunlight. We were out sort of testing it on a relatively sunny day, and I didn't struggle that much to see what I was getting on the screen. And of course, it has sort of those classic video tools like waveform monitoring to help with exposure, even if you're not getting the most accurate picture on the screen. When it comes to the storage that you're recording the footage onto, that's where things get a little weird. It technically has 2 slots. It's got a CF Express Type B slot, which is exactly what you would expect. And then it has a UHS-1 micro SD slot. I am not 100% what that's for. You could relatively easily shoot stills onto it as long as you're not trying to get into the relatively high burst rates that this camera supports. But for video, it's not going to be particularly useful.
No, and oddly, although the camera will shoot a proxy file when you're shooting some of its raw formats, there is no option to record that proxy file to the micro SD. It's probably simply not fast enough, even for the proxy files. So yeah, whether it's for basically copying your settings across to the camera, which would be quite useful in terms of quick setup, but it offers no real kind of redundant recording. And in terms of stills, it's probably worth pointing out that this camera doesn't have a mechanical shutter, and it has what Nikon calls a partially stacked sensor, so it doesn't have the same sort of readout speeds as the Z8 and Z9, which can get away without having a mechanical shutter because they read out so quickly. This is appreciably slower than that, so it's not going to be a great photographer's camera.
Let's talk a little bit about how this camera fits into Nikon's overall lineup. Now, Nikon already has some mirrorless cameras that are pretty credible video cameras. The Z6 III, the Z8, the Z9. I mean, all of these can take pretty credible video right now. So who does this camera appeal to, and why would they choose it?
I think it would appeal a lot to like sort of film students who won't necessarily care as much about the stills capabilities of, say, a Z6 III or Z8, and who want to save a little money, because basically you're getting all of the video features of the Z6 III plus more with that red codec and the 32-bit internal float for $500 less. You are also getting a camera that says red on it, which gets you a lot of clout.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I can only imagine that part of the goal of this camera is to put it in the hands of people like film students or young creators who are just getting started in their careers and essentially becoming the gateway into the Red ecosystem. Maybe today you use that Nikon camera that's got some Red branding, but you familiarize yourself with Red. Maybe you start using the R3D RAW codec and you become familiar with that ecosystem. Do you see this potentially as a play to get people into the wider Red ecosystem as they move up in their careers and capabilities?
I wouldn't be surprised if Nikon definitely considered that. And I don't want to imply that it's only for film students. Like it would be a perfectly credible A camera on some productions and definitely B camera on others where you may be shooting with a sort of larger, more expensive Red camera. And you want something that's smaller and cheaper that you may destroy in the process of doing whatever you're doing, that can cut together footage pretty easily with it. So there's a lot of use cases for it. I don't think you'll see this as sort of a major studio's main camera. It just doesn't have sort of the ergonomic setup for that. There's only a couple customizable buttons. But it is definitely like a credible video camera for a lot of single owner operator or small studio productions.
And I have to admit, I was even surprised at the price. Nikon, I feel, is being very aggressive with the price on this. And as I think one of you pointed out, it actually undercuts the Z6 III.
Yeah, it's what, $400-500 cheaper?
I want to say 5 after the Z6 III got its price bump last month.
Yeah, I think one of the comments I saw under the article about this is someone who commented that they'd love Nikon to make like a stills version or a rangefinder version of a camera that looks just like this. I mean, obviously there's a lot of talk about retro cameras and rangefinder cameras, and I know they're popular among enthusiasts, but is that something that Nikon could reasonably do with this camera? Is that the type of thing that could be transformed into that, or are we talking about a completely different kind of camera?
I think we're talking about a completely different type of camera. I mean, there is a lot of demand for rangefinder style cameras, though actually quite a lot of manufacturers have tried making them and then stopped making them because people ask for them, but when push comes to shove, they often buy the SLR shaped ones. Likewise, I've seen a couple of comments saying, "Oh, is there an accessory viewfinder for it?" And I know there were rumors that there was going to be. It is the first Nikon to have a hot shoe with digital contacts in it. The only accessory we've seen to use that so far is an external microphone. At present, they don't make an electronic viewfinder, and every manufacturer we've spoken to has said, actually, people just don't buy them. They demand them, and again, when it actually comes to getting their checkbook out, very few people actually go out and buy them. So I'm not, this isn't meant to be that camera, and it isn't. I think if Nikon decided it wanted to make a rangefinder style mirrorless camera, it would probably start with a blank piece of paper rather than starting with this camera, which, where a lot of thought will have been put into thermal management, where there isn't a mechanical shutter. It's roughly box shaped. That's where the commonality begins and ends. Going back to your point, I'm not sure I see this as a stepping stone into Red, given that all of the menus are exactly the same as the Z6. It is when you pick it up and hold it in your hand, it immediately feels like a Nikon. All the menus look and feel like Nikon. It's not going to teach you a single thing about what it's like to use a Red camera. And also, I'm just not sure I'm not sure how many, small scale filmmakers, whether that's students or vloggers, how many of them are ever going to encounter a full-on cinema camera. Those are almost different universes. To me, it feels more like, Sony has its alpha range of photography-focused cameras. It has its ZV range of vlogging cameras, and then it has its FX series of, cinema cameras. I think in this context, I'm almost seeing the Red as being Nikon's way of saying, look, this is a parallel line focused on video. And likewise, Canon has its EOS lineup for photography, and it has its cinema EOS lineup, again, much higher end. But it's got that clear demarcation, and this feels like a convenient way of Nikon being able to go, look, this is one of our video focused cameras. I doubt it'll be the last. I think we're only going to see more cross pollination between the two companies, but I see it more as a nice way of them being able to distinguish. Okay, these are our stills focused cameras. This is our more video focused line.
So you mentioned Canon. So you mentioned Canon, and maybe that's a good segue to talking about Canon's new camera that was announced this week. That's also a very video-focused camera. Maybe not quite the same as the ZR. Mitchell, I think you provided our initial coverage on that particular camera. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so it is like the ZR, a full-frame video-focused camera. It has I want to say 32 megapixel sensor, which appears to be a brand new model from Canon. They said it's not something that they've used in any of their cameras before, and that lets you record up to 7K footage at 60p in Canon RAW. Now, hearing that description, it kind of sounds a lot like the Nikon ZR, where it has, it's above 6K or above 4K, but below 8K RAW. It's got a full frame sensor, and it's focused on video. But that is about where the similarities between these two cameras end. It's very tempting to compare them, but they are aimed at quite different audiences, I think. The EOS C50 feels very much like a production camera that you would, use for a Netflix shoot. It's not Netflix certified yet. I would be very surprised if Canon didn't consider the requirements for that when they were making this camera, and I would be very surprised if Nikon did when they were making the ZR. To sort of a few illustrative comparisons between these two, the ZR has 3 or 4 customizable buttons, while the C50 has 14, all of which are labeled to make it very easy to tell which one you're changing. It's covered in quarter 20 sockets for attaching it to tripods and attaching various accessories, like the included handle with XLR inputs, and it has a full-size HDMI and timecode port. It has separate HDMI and timecode ports, where the ZR has a micro HDMI connector, which is something that you would want to use in a pinch and not want to rely on. So they're quite different audiences, these two cameras.
Yeah. Also, there's no stabilization in the C50. As I saw you mentioned in one comment, I think it's likely that most people will either be mounting this on a gimbal or on sticks most of the time. It's going to be used in a much more sort of planned environment than, I think the ZR crosses over between vlogging and small scale filmmaking, as opposed to being on a set, frankly, on a budgeted production. The fact that you can literally bolt different mount adapters onto the front of it, we're not talking about just clicking a different adapter onto the front. There are mounting points, and you can I think it's 4 Allen keys, and it bolts into the front of the camera to give you absolute stability. This is, conceptually, especially when one says, 6K60 in RAW, the others 7K60 in RAW, I can see where the similarities appear to be, but the more you delve into the spec, the more different the two cameras start to appear, and not least the price, where the Canon cost nearly twice as much as the Nikon.
So outwardly, by appearances, very similar, probably targeted at very different audiences. It sounds like the ZR is really a camera that's meant to be a little more self-contained, whereas the C50 is really meant in more of a traditional cinema format to be the core of a system that you build up depending on particular needs for production. Am I interpreting that right?
I think that's a pretty good read on it. The C50 sort of falls into an interesting place in Canon's cinema lineup, in that it's missing a couple of features that it's sort of more expensive options have. Like the C80 has a built-in ND filter. This doesn't. It's going to make it a little less versatile and make you have to think about taking it outside to shoot things. And then it has a relatively small battery. I believe it's the one from the EOS R5 II. So you will have to think about power management a bit more. They've, created an AC adapter for it. So there's a solution if you want to run it from mains power, but it is just one more thing to think about. And $3,900 doesn't seem like an aggressive price point, but I think for Canon in sort of the cinema area, it's on the lower end. And talking about gateways, maybe you get this to work on your small Netflix documentary, and then when you move on to a Netflix feature, you're like, I'm familiar with this. I'll move up to a C400 or a C800.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting to me is that this kind of camera is not something new. We've seen something like this before in the form of the Sony FX3. And that, when it first came out, I think we all looked at that and said, that's kind of an interesting experiment. Basically take the A7S III and put it in more of a cinema or video-oriented body. But now we're seeing something similar, albeit not exactly equal, from Nikon and Canon. Do you guys think this is really a new class of camera that's developing that we're going to see more of in the future?
I think once you've got 3 of the main players producing cameras in this territory, then I think, clearly there's a belief that there's an audience there. I think the parallel with the FX series is interesting, because from Sony, for about the same price as the C50, you get the FX3 that's as small as possible, doesn't have a built-in ND filter, but above that you have the FX6, which has a lot of the same underlying hardware, but does have a built-in Vari ND, does have more direct controls. So I think there's definite parallels there. And yeah, as I say, I've seen some commenters today talking, sort of comparing the ZR to the Sony ZV E10, which seems a little unreasonable since that's an APS-C camera. But I think the ZR is straddling that ZV vlogging camera and small scale filmmaker, more like an FX2 than an FX3 territory. So they're not like for like, but clearly all the manufacturers feel that there is an audience in that territory. It's fascinating that it's Sony and then Canon and Nikon entering this space and not Panasonic. They have their box versions of some of their cameras, and they are in the process of updating all of their S series cameras to sort of generation 2. But I'm sort of surprised it's not them leading the charge.
It does feel like a box camera version of the S1 II is inevitable, but it is surprising that we don't have that currently, with sort of the rest of the industry coming out with these sorts of cameras.
Yeah, I agree. I hadn't even thought of it in that perspective, but it is a little bit surprising that Panasonic isn't the one leading on this, since they've historically led on these video types of products and small packages. And to be fair, they have made some box cameras before, but very different types of tools than these. So before we wrap up, I don't want to leave everyone with nothing to talk about in the still photography world this week. And I think one of the really interesting things that I've enjoyed looking at this week are the 3 new Sigma lenses that were announced a couple of days ago. In particular, there's a 20 to 200 millimeter kind of travel-oriented lens. There's a 135 millimeter f1.4, which is kind of big, but it's really cool looking. And then there's also a 35 millimeter f1.2. Mitchell, I know you've had a chance to shoot all of these. What are your impressions of these lenses, and is there a particular one that stands out that you just think you need to have?
Well, as for my personal favorite, I'm always going to be sort of biased towards a wide-ish angle fast lens. So the 35-1.2 really spoke to me. But I feel like the 20 to 200 is probably going to be the more popular lens. I feel like Sigma is going to sell quite a lot of those, probably alongside like an A7C2. You could get a lot of image quality and reach in a very small package that I'm going to say, like, up until very recently, you couldn't have gotten outside of APS-C in terms of the size of kit that you're talking about. So it's quite an impressive kit, and coming in at just under $1,000 for that lens feels like a really good price point for, if we're honest, the one lens that quite a few people are going to buy. Like, there's going to be quite a few people who aren't sort of into collecting a bunch of different lenses for different scenarios. They just want one, and for a lot of people, that could be a really decent one. And then the 135, obviously, it's a first for mirrorless to have both or all 3 135 f1.4 and autofocus. There's quite a few f1.8s. Like, obviously Nikon has the Plana, and there's most manufacturers make something like that. And then there are a couple of manual focus only 135 f1.4s, but this is the first to be sort of that complete package. And from what I've shot with it so far, you can get some really, really stunning results with it.
Yeah, and all of these, I take it, are E mount and L mount for now.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, well, let's hope that the necessary steps occur to allow those to be available on a broader range of systems. I have to say, I'd really like to get my hands on the 35-1.2 because I shot with the Nikon 35-1.2 a couple of months ago and really enjoyed that. And this seems to be a comparable lens in a more compact format, which is always going to make it more usable. Whereas the 135 f1.4 sounds like fun, but that's a substantial lens. It's not often you get a portrait lens with a tripod foot. So although I like the idea, it does seem a little daunting.
And Richard, that's a really interesting point. And I know when we've talked with Kazuda Yamaki, the CEO of Sigma, on a couple of occasions, one of the things he's always stressed is his interest in developing really unique lenses, something that doesn't exist in the market today. And I feel like with at least a couple of these lenses, he's actually going after that particular goal. Do you think Sigma is showing the market what can be done here? Do you think they're making some interesting products that are going to appeal to people, or do you think some of these are just a little bit niche?
Well, some of them may undoubtedly be a bit niche, but I think that's great. I think it's great to have really high-end lenses catering to like the audience who will really love them, rather than sort of a lens for just everyone. And obviously Sigma makes those too. See the 20-200, but yeah, I think it's nice that they have those. I don't know how many manufacturers will follow the lead. And to Richard's point, there are some manufacturers that are not competing with this lens, though I do want to, every time we point that out, also point out that on E-mount, you are going to be limited in some ways. Particularly, I believe you can't shoot above 15 frames per second in continuous with autofocus. For most of these lenses, I do not see that as being much of a problem. But for something like the 200 f2 sports lens that Sigma released just a couple of months back, that's going to be a bit of a bigger pain point.
Yeah, I think not just these lenses, but if you look back at the other lenses Sigma has launched this year, it really does seem to have been on a roll. And you look at things like the I think it's 17-40 f1.8 for APS-C. Nobody else is making a lens anything like that. And somebody who shoots APS-C myself, it's really nice to gain that option. So I think I think you're right. I think Sigma is sort of balancing the mainstream lenses with some really interesting bits here and there. Then maybe not going to find huge audiences, but the people who want them and the people who are going to end up using them are going to end up really loving them. So I think it's fascinating to see some of the things Sigma's been doing this year.
Okay, now Sigma, do a 70-200 equiv for the APS-C, please.
Well, yeah, they used to make the 50-150 f2.8. The Mark 1 of that was lovely because it was about 2/3 the size and 2/3 the price of a 70-200, which meant it was so much easier to handle and gave you a genuine benefit over actually trying to fit a 70-200 onto APS-C. I mean, obviously, some people like the reach of a 70-200, but a 70-200 equiv for APS-C is a lovely thing. So.
Now, some of the lenses that really exhibit Mr. Yamaki's dedication to uniqueness and creating markets where they don't exist today are the really wide, fast lenses that Sigma has created for astrophotography. And a great example is really one of the first ones was the 14mm f1.8 lens for DSLR systems before mirrorless was even king of the hill. And that was a new class of lens. And a lot of people got into astrophotography because that lens existed. They didn't see a clear path to it before. It was just a little bit too difficult to do. And that lens actually grew the market for astrophotography just because of its existence. And now we've seen Sigma do follow-ups like a 14mm f1.4, which is a little bit more massive, but it is an amazing lens for astrophotography. And I think it's a really good example of where creating a unique product can actually create a market for a product that didn't exist that now people want to buy.
Yeah, also I think the DC-DN range, actually I think they might just be called DC in future, of little prime lenses, small, relatively affordable prime lenses for APS-C. Again, it suddenly makes all of those sort of mid to enthusiast level APS-C cameras so much more usable. It gives you, it gives you flexibility in terms of what you can do and boost the quality you can get out of them by suddenly giving you, f1.4 lenses. So yeah, that's, I think this is a fascinating range, from the, do everything 20-200, which as Mitchell says is, it's hard to get across how small it is. You look at it and think surely that can't be a full frame lens. But then 35 f1.2 and 135 1.4, these are radically different lenses, but in each case I think they're all I think they're all really interesting, and that's before you even get to their autofocus cine lens.
That's it. Yeah, it's I believe a cinema version of their full frame f1.8 zoom, which is wild.